But basically, this guy says, we already have Christ as salvation, but there are roads to God, and just like a map, there's 100 different roads, and those roads can be seen as like grace. God gives us grace in different ways, and so what the Protestants mean by means of grace, and this, so when we were going to a Presbyterian church, they kept saying that each week God needed to strengthen us to maintain our, to strengthen our faith and be able to defend, not that we would lose our salvation, but that God gave us this grace to be able to endure and to all these things, and that the communion was a means of this. This is all nonsense. And the reason it's all nonsense is because, first of all, it's not found anywhere in the scriptures. That's number one. There is nowhere in the scriptures that you can find that the Lord's Supper, quote unquote, and I have a whole different teaching that we could do on the Lord's Supper and the term Lord's Supper, because Paul does not use Lord's Supper for the communion. This has been proven by Andrew McGowan, who, by the way, is an Anglican priest. But the point is that that the communion was never seen as a means of grace by the early church. And beyond that, it wasn't seen by the Catholic Church as a means of grace until the Fourth Lateran Council in 1200.
Well, would you even say that the apostles didn't have a concept of means of grace?
No, of course not. And
it wasn't even a category of like.
Here's the thing: is that for me, communion, the Eucharist, the Lord's Supper, as the church has it today, with the elements of bread and wine, is a made-up, man-made tradition. And so what the church is doing, and this is my big beef with the church right now, what the church has done is they've taken a man-made, made-up tradition that's not found in Scripture, and they've attached all this meaning to it. And so when you're going to say something like, oh, the communion is a means of grace, you need to show me that in the Scriptures. I will show you where I think that the communion is not what you think it is. Now, people are going to go, obviously, to Luke 22:19. They're going to go also to 1 Corinthians 11. Both of those texts, I think I could show that we're not talking about bread and wine as elements that you would take on a Sunday morning or any other time as a form of a means of grace. This is not what is going on in the text. And I think it's been well proven by Christian scholars. You don't have the elements being solidified until the 4th century, the bread and wine. So you're telling me that the apostles, they didn't have a means of grace like we have today because it didn't actually come about until the 4th century? Nonsense. So,
well, and you'd have to answer, like in Acts, how many times it says every day, they were breaking bread. It's like, does that mean they were having communion every day? Do we want to import this later picture into their daily fellowship and their prayers? No.
I see this much like I see the Jewish tradition of wearing a kippah. Look, if you want to do that and you think that that's like commanded or something, go for it. I think it's a later tradition. I don't find it to be helpful in any way, shape, or form. In fact, if anything, I find it the opposite. And I think the same about the communion. If you are taking communion weekly or monthly or whatever, then that's up to you if you want to do that. However, I think that the idea of bread and wine or bread and juice as elements of something has become something totally separate from what it was originally intended, that people are completely missing all of what was meant originally.
Okay, let me ask you this on that point then. If like with this Susanna's email about means of grace, that means the people who go to that church are hearing the word grace. What is it they think? Like, how do they understand grace then? Like, do they, every time they're reading, let's say today we're reading from, Romans, and Paul's talking about grace in Romans. Are they then thinking, oh, the means of grace is our communion, and somehow our communion is tied? Like, to me, it can only make it cloudy. It can only cloud up what Paul is talking about grace. If I have some other place I'm using the term grace that isn't clear, and so that would be important to say, how do you understand, if this is a means of grace, define grace for me and define means, like what's happening.
There's a great some great discussion in the chat room here. Josh says, and this is great, Question: do corporate elements of worship like prayer, reading, singing, etc. sanctify and or refresh us on the Lord's Sabbath? And the answer is yes. And if you want to call that a means of grace, fine. However, prayer, reading scripture, and singing together are all commanded by God. And I would say this. Okay, now people are going to say I'm splitting hairs. But what I would say is that I think that eating together, and what I mean by that is a meal. I think that eating a meal together is a form of worship. And if you want to say that this is a means of grace, that's fine. However, what the Christian church has done is they've taken a tradition and these elements that are so watered down that it means something completely different than just a meal together. Look, if the church, and don't get me wrong, I go to a Christian church, by the way, and the Christian church does take communion together, okay? I would be much more comfortable if the church said, we're going to break and we're all going to go and we're all going to put tables out and we're going to eat together. And I would also say, because this is exactly what's being talked about in the scriptures, not some tradition that now stands for transubstantiation and now stands for a means of grace and all these things that have all these doctrines that are attached to them. What is being spoken of in the scriptures so often is actually eating together, meals together, and this is exactly what the church did all the way up into the 4th century. Thank you so much for watching this video. Tell us your thoughts on this subject by leaving a comment in the comment section. Make sure you like, share, subscribe, and enable those notifications, and we'll see you in the next video.